and welcome to this edition of Macro Matters. My name's Stephanie Kelly. I'm a political economist here at Aberdeen Standard Investments, and alongside my co-host, Paul Diggle, we're going to be guiding you through the complex world of economics, policy, politics, and markets at a time of really unusually high uncertainty. Today, Paul and I are joined by Jeremy Lawson, who's the head of our research institute here at Aberdeen Standard Investments and our chief economist. Welcome to the show, Jeremy.
Thanks, Steph. It's great to be on.
Today, we're going to be looking at how COVID-19 might affect policy and the economy as we go into winter. And then we're going to jump into the latest debate that's been raging between economists and investors alike. Should we be worried about inflation taking off? But first, with kids back at school and winter approaching, naturally, Boris Johnson and a number of other leaders have come out with serious concerns about the outlook for COVID as we face ever more challenging approaches to policy.
I want to be absolutely clear. These measures are not another national lockdown. The whole point of them is to avoid a second national lockdown. By bearing down on social contact and improving enforcement, we can keep schools and businesses open in the knowledge that they are COVID secure. I've always said schools and colleges should only ever be shut again as a very, very last resort.
So that was Boris Johnson clearly raising concerns about the potential for increasing COVID cases and the potential to have to reinstitute lockdowns. Now, let's kick off. Paul, I want to hear your take on this.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steph. So a second wave of coronavirus is hitting Europe. Daily new case numbers in France and Spain are higher than they were measured to be in the spring. In the US and the UK and others are also seeing an increase. Meanwhile, the first wave never really went away in the likes of Brazil or India or the US, although the latter has done a bit better recently. And with the Northern Hemisphere winter on its way, the concern is obviously that a full-scale resurgence of the virus becomes out of control. Now, while all this is already causing the economic rebound to slow, I don't think we should be forecasting full lockdowns and double-dip recessions, at least as a baseline. For one, the outbreak is less deadly than the first, whether it's because it's concentrated in younger populations or treatments are getting better. Second, the outbreak, for now at least, is actually much, much smaller than it was in the spring, when the vast majority of cases weren't picked up. And third, political incentives are clearly for localized lockdowns backed up by testing and tracing infrastructure. But the risks are really clear. The failure of test and trace programs, the spread of the virus into old age settings, which sends mortality higher, limited adherence to local restrictions, they're all clear downside risks that could lead to full-scale lockdown. Either way, winter is coming.
What an ominous way to start the podcast. Great. Thank you so much, Paul. I think that's probably an appropriate tone to strike, given we're talking about a global pandemic. And as you said, going into winter, there seems to be heightened concerns around this. So I just wanted to dig in a little bit more, particularly on the point you made about lower death rates amid higher case rates. And I wonder, could you just maybe explain a little bit more, what are the various reasons that this might be? And I suppose the obvious question is the virus getting less dangerous?
Yeah, so we've had, I think, really two big developments. One is that Europe has experienced a resurgence and community transmission is ongoing in the US and elsewhere. And in Europe, Spain was clearly the first to experience a second wave from about the start of August onwards. France is now also approaching sort of 10,000 cases a day above what it was measured at in the spring anyway. Italy, Germany doing a bit better, but starting to see outbreaks. And of course, the UK now in the past few weeks, really seeing quite a quick spike upwards. But what's different this time around is that hospitalizations and deaths, while they are moving higher for certain, and that's clearly worrying, they haven't increased by anything like the amount they increase in the spring. And I think that's probably for a few reasons. The biggest explanation is probably just that the first wave was enormously undermeasured in terms of cases, maybe by a factor of, 5, 10, 20, almost pick a number. So deaths looked proportionally much, much worse then than they do now. But that's really just because this wave is far smaller. Maybe the second factor is the outbreak has shifted younger. There is a lower mortality rate amongst younger people, but perhaps that's temporary. Perhaps treatments, certainly treatments are better. Hospital capacity is increased. That's probably lowered mortality, but maybe it's just increased the lag between cases and deaths. And then finally, what you're hinting at there, Steph, which is maybe a little bit more speculative, is that the virus itself, the strain of the virus, may have mutated to be less deadly. I mean, that is something that can happen in pandemics. There's almost like a selection pressure, a natural selection pressure towards a less deadly virus that doesn't kill its host as quickly. But of course, the opposite was the case in the Spanish flu, for example. So I think that final explanation is a little bit more of a speculative one.
Sure. No, I think that's a really useful account of where we're at. So maybe, Jeremy, if I come to you now and ask about, obviously the discussion Paul and I have been having is very developed market focused. What are we seeing in emerging markets? Are we seeing similar trends? How different are the challenges there?
Sure. Just to add actually something to what Paul said before I move on to emerging markets.
Yeah, of course.
In a number of countries, it was the way that the virus got into aged care facilities in particular was what caused a very high fatality rate early on. So in some countries, it turns out that between 40 and 50% of all fatalities occurred in some of those facilities. So I do think maybe another aspect of this is the learning process of the vulnerabilities that existed and the better ability to protect the vulnerable relative to what was the case in March and April, where, let's face it, a number of countries, maybe they shouldn't have been caught by surprise, but they were in practice. But sort of when it comes to emerging markets, I think that adage we talk about very often, which is it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about emerging markets in the aggregate because there are enormous differences in what's taking place within emerging markets, right? So we have to speak quite concretely about particular trends. Probably if we start from the top in terms of right now where things are worse, well, India sort of tops the scale. There's maybe an indication that at least a local peak in the number of new cases is being reached, but really India has just experienced one long wave where the number of daily cases has been edging closer and closer to 100,000 per day over the past few months. And I guess India provides an example of just how if you have cities with a particular type of population density pattern, right, and it's a relatively poor country, and the ability of the public health system to respond to that is constrained, is just how bad, at least in terms of how endemic it becomes within the population, it can be. So India is probably the place where things have been worse, and correspondingly also where the largest hit to GDP in the second quarter came. So a very clear correspondence there. From regional perspective, Latin America is the region that has fared the worst in this particular crisis. We did some analytical work a little while ago that showed that there were demographic characteristics that probably meant that there was greater vulnerability in Latin America, again, particularly with the density of the living in a number of the major cities in Latin America. And so you've seen very adverse trends in Brazil, in Peru, in Chile, in Mexico. In many cases, this was made worse by the authorities initially not taking the crisis as seriously as they should have. I think, to be fair, though, to many governments, Latin America was spared the ravages of SARS and MERS, and so just wasn't prepared for the crisis that came along. The good news, though, at least, is that you're seeing that the number of new cases in many of those countries is coming down. So, for example, even in Brazil, whilst it's still an endemic, the number of new daily cases has sort of halved over the course of the last sort of 7 or 8 weeks, right? So there is progress taking place in some countries. But then, just as things are getting better in some places, they're getting worse in others. So Israel is probably the example at the moment, which is going through, what is genuinely an additional second wave, where they're reaching sort of new peaks in daily cases, and where they've just announced that they're going to go through a national shutdown, and so where, as a result, particularly once we get into the fourth quarter, it'd be very difficult for the Israeli economy to grow in the fourth quarter given those circumstances.
So I think that's a really useful summary, Jeremy, of the challenges you have both regionally and across countries. And I think, it kind of points to this issue of a whack-a-mole strategy, whereby just as cases are coming down in one country, they're going up in another. But then even within the UK, we talk about this issue of cases rising in one area, falling in another. And I guess I'm really interested in this kind of quite controversial question, which is there a trade-off between how open the economy is, how successful the economy is, and how successful the public health strategy is in the context of COVID? Paul, I'll go to you first on this.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. To the extent that a trade-off exists between the virus and lockdowns and the performance of the economy, it's probably only short term. I think it is the case that the Q1, Q2 economic contractions, the biggest explanatory variable in those contractions across countries was cases and lockdown stringency. Other things mattered, policy responses mattered, but the bigger your case numbers, the more stringent your lockdown, the bigger the economic contractions you suffered. Now, whether it's cases that are doing the work there or lockdown stringency, it's not necessarily clear to me. There are examples of, say, Sweden, where you had quite a high number of cases, at least relative to Nordic neighbours. The stringency of lockdown wasn't particularly bad, but the economy did badly, at least relative to comparable other Nordic economies. Meanwhile, there are plenty of studies that are telling you that the effective cessation in economic activity in a lot of economies preceded the formal imposition of lockdown. So behavioural changes, which were triggered by fear of the virus and growing virus cases, personal behavioural changes were perhaps the big driver there. Certainly in the long term, I don't think there's any trade-off. And indeed, it may be the other way around, right? The less stringent a lockdown equals more economic damage in the long run. And there are definitely studies from the Spanish flu that compare different US cities and the stringency of lockdown that they had, which are telling you that the correlation runs from less stringent lockdown, worse virus control, more long-term economic damage. Because in the end, what matters for the long-term damage of the economy is, do you control the pandemic or not? So maybe as a short-term trade-off, in the long term there isn't. And it's interesting, actually, that's kind of like how we as economists think about things like the Phillips curve. It is a slope in the short term, but it's vertical in the long term.
I think that's great. I think that's a useful way to think about it, that kind of short-term, long-term trade-off. I mean, Jeremy, I'm keen to bring you in here, and in particular, ask if you agree with Paul, but also maybe ask about whether there's any evidence that certain policies have been more effective than others, and whether there is kind of, we've talked about before, is there low-hanging fruit for policymakers in terms of, policy stringency that also allows for COVID control? Is there any evidence of that yet?
Yeah, so this is where I'm going to furiously agree with Paul. What I mean by that is I have a lot of sympathy for the idea that in the long run this trade-off is weak if it exists at all. I mean, to make it sort of more concrete, if the British government tomorrow announced that it was relinquishing all formal legal restrictions on the type of activity that I could engage in, that doesn't mean that I'm going to start to behave as though the pandemic doesn't exist, right? So my behavior is a function of my perception of threat. Now, that perception of threat is going to vary across the population, but what I would contend is that there's a proportion of the population that remains highly risk averse and sensitive to news. And so one of the goals is to be able to, at some point in the future, normalize activity. That can only really happen if people have confidence that the public health crisis is over or nearly over, and so that the threat to themselves and their families is very low. What you do, though, Steph, is you raise a very important question, which is we can accept that whilst also agreeing that there are strategies that can be deployed by governments that make that trade-off appear less adverse, or at least what they allow you to do is perhaps achieve both a better economic outcome and a better health outcome. Lockdowns were largely imposed because of the absence of alternatives in a number of countries. But there were some countries, particularly in East Asia, so if we look at South Korea and Taiwan, where the nature of those interventions was both lighter, but then the ability to stop it becoming truly endemic in the community was also greater, right? So think about, again, closer to home here, the debate about track and trace systems. Well, if you have a very effective track and trace system operating, then your opportunity of catching outbreaks at an early stage, stopping them from becoming endemic in the community, and then forcing even a localized lockdown is lower. Similarly, right, something as simple as being prepared to wear a mask every time you come into contact with other people, right, which is a very low cost action on my behalf, but can have a powerful impact on the prevalence of the disease in the community. That again is an example of how, as we learned through this pandemic, we can find, as you say, what you've called low-hanging fruit, but I would call low-impact interventions, or low impact on my personal behavior interventions, but potentially a large impact on the prevalence of the virus. So we're becoming better at that. And I think it feeds then back into the very first question you asked of Paul, which is sort of one of the reasons why we're not sort of expecting as a baseline the stringency of the lockdown and the damage to economic activity this time around, even if the virus does get worse again before it gets better, particularly in the northern winter.
That's great. I think that link into the COVID cases is quite clear and quite clearly made. Maybe as a final roundup on this section, I'm interested in, there's a little bit of a debate in the UK in particular, but I think more broadly around what you keep open and what you keep closed in a world where you're not going back into national lockdown, but you do choose things to be closed or to be open. And I'm interested from maybe your personal perspectives, but also from an economic perspective in particular. There's this debate, that is set up as kind of, do you keep schools open or do you keep pubs open? Now, obviously people have personal views on this, but maybe more so from an economist perspective, how do you see that trade-off? And I guess being a little bit speculative and a little bit dangerous here, which are you on the side of, schools or pubs? Paul, I'll go to you first.
So to give the personal answer first, as a parent of a young child with very few opportunities to go to the pub, I of course say keep the schools open. But more seriously, it's obviously a difficult trade-off, and there are genuine arguments for either. I think maybe I'll throw two considerations. One, governments have to figure out what is doing the heavy lifting in terms of containing spread of the virus, and that's largely an empirical question that has to be evidence-based. And it seems like in the UK, what had been doing the heavy lifting seemed to be not going into each other's homes, and that seems to be one vector of transmission. But equally, there have been clear instances where closing pubs seem to be doing some of the heavy lifting as well. Now, the evidence in schools, I think, it's more difficult to assess, but my reading of the balance of evidence is that fewer person-to-person transmissions are happening within a school setting. Again, all this continually has to be assessed against evidence. And the second consideration I'll sort of lob in is that you have to think of broader economic ramifications. Closing schools has implications both for parents and their ability to work when they're doing childcare on the side as well, and it has long-term downstream implications, of course, for the education of those children. So but look, it's a super difficult trade-off to make.
Yeah, no, I think that's well made. Jeremy, do you agree?
I do broadly agree. I think you could even make a stronger argument, right? So why are our children in education? Well, they're in education for human capital formation, right? And even, the reality in many countries is that education systems were not well set up to deliver online education to a very large number of pupils. Look again in the furor over how the exam system was managed for both GCSEs and A levels in the United Kingdom, right? But it's not marking per se. It's about, how much less education did you receive and what the long-term consequences of that are. So not only can schools being closed inhibit human capital formation, but it inhibits the ability of particularly women who face a sort of a more arduous or difficult trade-off with how to manage work commitments in many cases. And so if you can find a way to open schools that, that can keep the risk of spread of the virus relatively low, right? And again, many schools are opening in a way that is, we'll call it COVID aware in the way that it's being done, then that seems very sensible. Whereas, for all the cultural attachment, that many of us have to pubs and having a beer on a Saturday afternoon, I would argue from a long-term economic perspective, that's a less vital consideration. And so if you're going to give me a choice, you force me to have the choice of pubs or schools. I don't think it's really that choice is as stark as that, but if you're going to say choose pubs or schools, I choose schools every day of the week.
I think you've both made a pretty clear case for the long-term benefits of education and indeed the short-term benefits for working parents like yourselves. I'm not sure, Jeremy, you've ever had a pint in a pub on a Saturday afternoon, but I think that the point was not made.
Now, Steph.
So, look, I think we've covered that off pretty well and been quite in depth in terms of not only the health element, but also the economics of COVID and the policy choices that are being made. One of the other big debates that's raging at the moment is around inflation. And in particular, you see quite hysterical headlines, either saying inflation's about to take off and be out of control, or indeed we're moving into a deflationary period for the entire global economy. So I'm keen to kind of get to grips with what all the fuss is about here. So Jeremy, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so if we're trying to begin with the question of why is this so topical, it's really interesting because you could argue that inflation expectations have never been as well anchored as they are today, right? Across most of the major economies, and I'd include a lot of emerging markets in that, where underlying inflation's come down quite significantly from what was common in earlier decades, right? And so one way to think about that is, well, if inflation expectations are really well anchored, albeit in a number of countries probably lower than would be ideal, especially with reference to central bank inflation targets, then shouldn't we be far less worried about a major change in the inflation environment rather than more worried? Yet, if my email inbox is anything to go by, or my reading of the newspapers, the speculation or the debate about this, as you say, is very heightened. So what explains that? Well, I think a couple of things explain it. One is that, again, if we sort of put our hats on of being inside the asset management industry, you make money by anticipating what comes next, not what's already in the price. And so if the low inflation regime and the maintenance of it is already in the price of assets, then it makes sense to think about, well, how stable is that regime, and to consider what might come next more broadly. So the incentive structure skews in that direction. I think the second aspect, and this is where I probably take issues with this debate a little bit more, is that I think that there is sometimes a tendency to extrapolate from aspects of the macro environment and policy environment into the long-term inflation outlook without really fully understanding just how difficult it is for those changes to translate into higher inflation. So I'll give you a good example, which is government budget deficits and public debt. In the advanced economies, whether you look at very simple correlations or the much more extensive empirical literature on this question, there is no evidence that provides any special insight into the inflation outlook, right? There is no deliberate and direct connection from that into higher inflation regimes. Similarly, there is a very weak correlation between growth in the money supply and core inflation in the advanced economies over the past 40 years. So another way of putting this, and I like this term, which is think about what are the necessary conditions to have a change in inflation regime and what are sufficient conditions. Many of the policies that people are fretting about at the moment, I would regard as neither necessary nor sufficient to see a major change in the inflation regime, which tends to mean to me that there are concerns being expressed about that outlook that are not warranted. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't circumstances in which this inflation regime or equilibrium norms might not change in a significant way, but we do have to think about it in a more nuanced fashion than what some of that debate allows for at the moment.
Jeremy, I think that was a really useful summary of where we stand and a useful intro to this discussion. I think maybe to pick up on your last point, you mentioned there are circumstances that you would look for. What are the kinds of circumstances where you would have to see, let's take the first case, much, much higher inflation? What are the kinds of circumstances? And I guess to your point, what do you see that suggests we're not seeing those circumstances yet?
Sure. So I would say that there are three conditions that you would look for, and you might place slightly different weight. So there's no single path, to higher inflation. I think three things. First, the nominal anchor. Think of it as inflation expectations. The more fragile those expectations, or the more that they've been shocked to the upside, then the larger the risks. So, for example, I would argue in the 1970s, not only were inflation expectations less well anchored than they are today, but then you had an enormous negative supply shock, right? So the oil crisis, which then sort of saw near-term inflation surge, right? So that was a key ingredient. So a fragile nominal anchor is number one. Number two is a sustained period of excess demand in the economy. Right. And so, economists use this term output gaps, but really just think of that as the economy is operating in excess of its capacity to operate without price pressures emerging in the economy. Now, in an environment, again, where expectations for inflation are relatively well anchored, right, then actually you need a very large amount of excess demand, right? You need those capacity constraints to be really pressured and for a long period of time to see inflation change in a significant way. But that would be another thing that I'd be looking for. And so again, let's relate that to the current environment. Not only do we have still quite very low, well-anchored inflation expectations, but I think we would argue that this is more of a demand shock than a supply shock, that in most economies there's very significant excess capacity in the economy, not a shortage of capacity. And so it's very premature to be worrying about much higher inflation. The third, and this is, I think, is probably what a lot of people are getting at with their long-term worries, and it relates to what we might think of as the reaction function of the central banks themselves. So there is a basic principle of monetary policy that is, so if you've got an inflation target or a price level objective, however it's described, that if your forecasts, your expectations for inflation rise to a level that are not consistent with achieving that objective, that you're committed to tightening monetary policy, lifting real interest rates in such a way to offset it, right? So there's this basic corrective mechanism through policy that stops any inflation shock from sort of spiraling out of control. So I think when a lot of people, they look at what's happening with fiscal policy and monetary policy at the moment, there are some who are starting to doubt that that corrective mechanism exists, either because they think that governments, right, are going to force the hand of central banks. Think of it as a form of what we call fiscal dominance, whereby government policy, government spending is set in a way so that there's no real connection, or at least not an acknowledgement that a long-run budget constraint exists, that very strong spending isn't sort of financed by taxation, It is financed by debt, and then there's pressure that comes on the central bank to absorb that debt, but in a way that's not consistent with those normal monetary policy objectives. Or alternatively, that the central bank itself just turns a blind eye independently to any change in the inflation environment. But without those three things being in place, it's very difficult to get shocked into a much higher inflation equilibrium. And so the way that we would sort of see it is that changes in the political and the policy trade-offs, then yes, the probability of that bad type of inflation setting in through a form of fiscal dominance has probably increased relative to what was the case sort of 12, 18 months ago. But it shouldn't in any way be considered a base case given the nature of the challenges we find ourselves in at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that point about the kind of fiscal element and the role of politicians in kind of encouraging bad behavior by central banks, I think is one that I never cease to be amazed by, the ability for markets to simultaneously worry that governments won't do enough or might, prematurely end fiscal policy, or else will do too much. And, that kind of, that, I suppose, either way we end up in a bad situation is quite striking. Paul, I might just bring you in here for the last bit and ask you about Europe, because clearly Europe is a place where inflation has been particularly weak in recent years. I'm interested to understand how you're seeing the outlook there and any risks, particularly maybe to the downside. We've talked a lot about inflation taking off. Do you see any risks of actual genuine deflation taking place?
Yeah, I do. And actually, I think the balance of risks is probably skewed in the disinflation and even deflationary direction as a result of this crisis, not just in Europe, but perhaps everywhere, but especially in Europe. And it's for a few reasons, which I think Jeremy's already enunciated really well. Expectations are anchored at very low levels. Belief that the European Central Bank can meet its inflation target is fairly low. The ability of the central bank in Europe to more than offset any shortfall in inflation by cutting its normal interest rate, i.e. obeying the Taylor principle that Jeremy's been talking about, is really lacking in Europe because there's essentially no policy space or exceedingly limited policy space to at least to cut the main policy interest rate. And because Europe has for a fairly long time, I think, suffered from a chronic shortfall in demand, which has been weighing on inflation for more than a decade. We've been anchored in a regime of sort of around 1% core inflation in Europe for a good 4 or 5 years, when the ECB's target, of course, is 2%. So for me, yeah, the risks are definitely skewed in that direction, and Europe is a good leading example of where that is the case.
Thanks so much, Paul. I think that's a particularly useful example of how many investors might be looking in one direction when really we should also be looking both ways before crossing the road. So on that note, we have run out of time for this episode. Thank you so much to Paul and to Jeremy for joining.
Thank you, Steph.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Steph.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll be back again next week, where we're going to be looking at the outlook for a vaccine and how economists can start to think about what that looks like for the global economy. Thanks so much and take care.
This podcast is provided for general information only and assumes a certain level of knowledge of financial markets. It is provided for information purposes only and should not be considered as an offer, investment recommendation, or solicitation to deal in any of the investments or products mentioned herein, and does not constitute investment research. The views in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily reflect those of Aberdeen Standard Investments. The value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up, and investors may get back less than the amount invested. Past performance is not a guide to future returns. Return projections are estimates and provide no guarantee of future results.